Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Fukushima Ryu Ninjutsu video. In this video, I'm going to actually take a break. Me and you, the viewers, we're going to take a break from going over more esoteric teachings. Usually on this channel, we focus on big concept ideas, esoteric ideas. But we're going to take a break from that for a bit. And this video is actually going to focus on the discussion of a physical technique. And now this physical technique is one that is actually fairly commonly known in the quote-unquote ninja world. And by ninja world, I mean the people who are interested in ninjutsu in the modern times, right? You know, whether they're interested in it for historical reasons or reenactment or martial arts or whatever, the quote-unquote ninja world. This technique is known in the ninja world. However, like so many other techniques, it's greatly misunderstood. Or rather, I should say, the actual technique has become very oversimplified, and many people haven't understood the technique in that larger big thought way. So I guess technically this is still going to be another big concept video, but it's going to be big concept based around a particular physical technique. That technique is using a sword to climb a wall. And a lot of you are going to probably go, well, we know that already. That's in so many different books. In the Bansenjukai, it's in the Shonin-ki, and it's, in so many modern ninja books. Yes, it is. But it's very simplified and very misunderstood. And there's a great principle here that is missing in that oversimplification. So let's look at it. First, we're going to look at the documents, and I'm going to give you some important notes, some important concepts. Then we're going to take a real look at this technique and how it combines with other skills. So hint, spoiler alert, this technique was never just about using a sword to climb a wall. So go ahead and look at your screen. And that image that you're looking at comes from the Tokyo Museum's copy of the Fukushima Ryu manual. Now I want to remind the viewer that it is my opinion, through detailed analysis and assessment, that the Tokyo Museum's copy and the copy that was stolen from the National Archives, both of these copies, which are book forms and contain the annotation addendum, I don't believe that either of these copies are official documents. I believe that they were private, personal copies. They were never formal Fukushima Ryu documents. The other thing that I want to point out is that the drawings and the way the drawings are different in these books from the actual scroll. So basically, if you don't know, my family, the Nojiri, we have the official Fukushima Ryu scroll that has the seals, the signatures, the stamps, all of that. It is laid out differently. It flows differently. It has additional information in it, etc., etc. Ninjutsu researchers have only been using either the Tokyo Museum copy, or Fujita Seiko copied the Tokyo Museum copy. So they either use Fujita Seiko's copy of the Tokyo Museum's copy, or they use the Tokyo Museum's copy. But the viewer needs to understand that the Tokyo Museum copy is very different from the actual official original scroll. And that is why I'm taking the time to point some of this out. So for example, so the spikes are drawn differently in this version. The sword is drawn differently. But most importantly, the original scroll has an additional piece of the diagram that shows knots and ropes. It's not extensive, but there is an additional piece to the diagram that reminds you about knots and ropes. It is missing from the Tokyo Museum copy, the National Archive copy, etc., etc. The book form does not have the rope diagram memory aid. But let's just take a second also to talk about the flow difference, and then we'll get back to it. But since we're on topic, the book form, which is the Tokyo Museum form, not the original official scroll, not the official document, but this private document, so the front of the page shows the folded paper and the quill torch, and then, so that would be on your left-hand side. Then you would turn the page, because remember, old samurai manuals turn opposite from Western books. You would turn the page, and then on the back of the page, which would now be on your right-hand side, you have, it looks like that. But I can tell you this is not how it flows in the scroll. For again, in the official actual scroll, there is an additional piece to the diagram. So in purple, you see the question marks. It's just the rope diagram's missing, and and then in orange, the origami ember carrying device is literally in the actual scroll. The picture comes after the entry. So even just the arrangement, and I'm going to get into how this arrangement also kind of messes up the understanding. Now go ahead and look at your screen, and what you're seeing is a digital recreation of this part of the manual, how it exists in the real scroll, the official scroll. Now before I go on, the reason I'm using a digital recreation is because I've decided I'm not going to post pictures of the original scroll on the internet. Essentially, I don't want people to steal the images and use them, etc., etc., etc. Right? So I'll use digital recreations. Now you may say, but in previous videos you have some pictures of the original. That's true. I do. And I've put them online, but I'm not going to put anything else online, just to keep the original safe. But I will discuss it, but I will use digital recreation. So you can see this digital recreation. This is how it flows in the original scroll. So rather than flipping through pages in a book, imagine you have the scroll rolled out, and you have the folded paper technique, you have the quill torch technique, the mercury quill technique. Then you have the spikes, the sword. Of course, the spikes and the sword look different in the original. And then right where that red circle is, that's actually where the knot and rope diagram appears. And again, it only appears to be in the original scroll, not in any of the book copies. Then I want you to see how after that, the origami device is not right next to the sword. It's actually after the entry for the origami device. Now I want you to pay attention to that, and you can see it's like technique, picture, technique, picture, technique, picture, and that's how the whole scroll goes through, technique, picture. So now, and I'll put this up on, and this will pop up on another frame, but think for a second. Hey, wait a minute. When you're flipping through the book, it seems like the sword and the fence thing is separate from the mercury quills, but when you see it in the original scroll, all of these images are right next to each other. So basically, if you look at your screen, on the left is the digital recreation of how it looks in the original scroll, and then on the right is how it is in the book form. And so you can see that splitting the pages can give you a false sense that the sword climbing section and the mercury-filled quill torch is somehow completely separate. But when you see how it runs together in the original official scroll, you understand that there's some kind of connection between the sword climbing and the quill torch. And this also clues you in, not only that there's a connection between these two, but possibly there could even be more to this technique than just using a sword to climb. In other words, there's something deeper here. But the way it's laid out in the book form, it's very easy to miss it. But when you see it laid out in the scroll, you're like, these go together somehow. There's something more going on here. Now for this video, we're not going to discuss the relationship between the mercury quill torch and the climbing. Sorry. But what we will discuss is something else. So like I said, we're not going to go into how the mercury quill torch and the climbing go together. But what we're going to look at is another technique entirely. And I'm going to show you how different techniques actually run together. So you have the technique called the Genji ink stick. And if you guys read however you are familiar with the Fukushima Ryu English translation, whether it's mine or whether it's someone else's, you will know that the Genji ink stick is wood soaked in oil. Right. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's obvious, that's a weapon. Yes, of course it could be used as a weapon. Anything in theory could be used as a weapon. Okay, but that's not the point. The primary idea is using it as a battering ram, or like as a sledgehammer, it's a battering device, right? But you can also use it to climb things. So here's the rough idea. You have this wood beam which has already been oiled so that it's strengthened, and then you carry it on your back. You get to a wall. You tie rope correctly to the beam, and then you brace beam against wall. You use it to climb up, then you use the rope to pull beam up. And then later you can use the ink stick to breach an entry point. And hint, spoiler, you can also use it to provide footing when moving along higher entry points. So like if you're up high and you're moving from point A to point B and you perhaps need just a little bit extra footing, if you have this wooden beam, you can set it down between 2 points, and now you've got a footing point. You have a place you can actually put your foot now. Anybody who's worked in construction has probably done this before. You need to reach over to get to something and you can't get to it, so you take like a 2x4 and you put it between 2 points and use it to step on, right? Same principle. So go ahead and look at your screen, and I want to talk about how this appears in the scroll. Now the scroll, it only mentions that ink stick is something that uses namomi oil, which is a cockleburl. It's a plant-based oil. And then it says that it's kuden, right? That it has to be explained in person. Oral tradition, kuden. Now the other thing that I want to remind you of, and here's some kuden-like explanation. I'm calling it the ink stick because that's kind of a slang name for it, right? But what it's really called here is Genji family entry black. What is that? Well, Genji family because it comes from it's got a Genji background. Entry black, the entry part refers to it being used to get into places, either by battering into places or using it or to climbing it and stuff to get into places. That's what the entry part means. The black refers to an ink stick, the way that an ink stick is just infused with ink, even though technically it's a solid, you have to put water on it. But the idea is that the wood being infused with the oil is like an ink stick. So that's where the name ink stick comes from. So the Genji family entry black, or the ink stick. That's the name. Now, and then the cockleburl oil is the plant-based oil that you're using to strengthen it. Now, you have to ask why, if you didn't know what I just explained to you, you'd be like, why are you infusing this with oil? What is this, right? But like I said, it's a battering ram, it's a beam to help climb. It can provide footing, extra footing in some instances, etc., etc., etc. So that's what comes in the scroll, just that one little bit. And then everything else is someone explaining it to you. So anyway, back to climbing with it. So if you tie it up correctly, like I said, you can use it to climb the same way that you would use the sword to climb. So this reminds you that the technique of using the sword to climb is actually, in reality, it's the technique of using any tool or weapon to climb, not just the sword. So the idea here that I want you to understand is that once you have the correct understanding of the principle of the technique, you apply that principle to multiple applications. Once you understand how to properly tie off the sword and use it to climb, you can then use the ink stick in the same way, or you could use a spear in the same way, or possibly even a musket in the same way. Excuse the typo, it says muskie, but it should say musket. You could even use a musket. If the object can be wedged properly and it can withstand your weight as you step on it and go up, and you tie it off correctly, then in theory pretty much anything can be used. That is the actual lesson, right? So the sword, you take the sword for a particular reason. You take the ink stick for a particular, like the sword is a weapon, so you've got it on you because it's your weapon. The ink stick is a battering ram, or it can be also used to help you transverse from point A to point B. That's why you're taking it with you. A spear is a weapon, etc., etc., etc. Your musket is a weapon. But the idea is that regardless of what you're going to use it for, when done correctly, that tool or weapon doubles as climbing gear. That is the principle. However, it seems that a lot of people never caught that or understood that, and they only understand this as just someone using a sword to climb a wall. And they feel like that's the end of the technique, that's it. And that's a very shallow and simple way of thinking. It's failing to learn the principle and to apply the principle wide and far. It's not a very efficient way to govern yourself. So what you see on your screen are some very crude pictures, but essentially you get the point. So the red would be, now they're oversimplified and the proportions are not correct, but the idea here is the ink stick, which would be red, is tied off properly. So correct way of tying it off, that's the blue. And then you wedge it properly. Then you climb. And once you're up, you then use the rope to pull it up. It's really that simple. It's just straightforward. The principle is you have a weapon or tool that has its own purpose, but you learn and apply this climbing strategy. And so therefore any tool or any weapon, if you can use it, if it meets the criteria, can be used to climb. So in this case, this person is using the ink stick to climb, but you can use a sword, you can use a spear. Matter of fact, let's just keep going with this. But basically this diagram, it is that simple ultimately. The trick is to know how to tie it off correctly, and the trick is to know which things can take it and which things cannot take it. And of course you can think this out further. For example, the ink stick in theory can be used as a fall break in a desperate situation. That is, if you need to fall or descend a little further than you should be, in other words, drop down further than is safe. In theory, you can use the ink stick, which has been reinforced with the oil, you can use it to help you descend without hurting yourself. This is very similar to something that's discussed in the Shoninki text, which is a document from the Natori-ryu tradition. So in that text, it discusses using wood beams to fall or to descend from heights that are unsafe. So in theory, the strengthened wood could hold up better to the force from the fall. However, I will not explain this any further, and I will not provide any pictures, right? It's just, it's a risky technique, and I do not advise anyone to even pretend to attempt this, right? I'm just presenting this as historical details, right? And it's a theory. But again, I advise against anyone ever trying it in real life. So earlier we mentioned possibly a spear, so this page is essentially showing that same thing, right? You can use a spear, pikes, spears. The principle remains the same. If it's correctly wedged and it can take your weight and you tie it off correctly, then it works. So on the right side of your screen though, again, if you don't tie the tool or the weapon correctly, it will flop all over the place. It will be difficult to bring it up. It will make a lot of noise, and the entire idea of a stealth entry will be completely ruined because your tool or weapon is flopping all over the place, making all kinds of noise as you lift it up. It has to be tied correctly. So let's talk about that a little bit. So using modern terms, we would say that one of the best techniques, one of the best ways to do this, is to use a clove hitch near the bottom of the tool or the weapon, then run the line up, and then do a half hitch higher up, and then run the line to you. So a clove hitch and a half hitch. Obviously, in Edo period Japan, they never would say clove hitch and half hitch. Obviously, those are modern English terms, but they are the best modern terms. They're the best approximate matching terms. Now, if you don't know how to do half hitches and clove hitches, just Google it. I hate to say it, but just Google it. It's clove hitches and half hitches are pretty common knots. Just Google it, try it, study it. We don't need to go on. The video is already long enough as it is. We don't need to go into it more and more and more. But clove hitch at the bottom, half hitch halfway up, then run to you. This is the ideal setup. Now I do want to stop for a moment and remind the viewer, or warn the viewer, that this is only a very brief overview of this concept. Usually when I do a video, as anybody who's been watching the channel for a while now, or if you're new to the channel, I usually like to take my time and go into more and more detail about each aspect. But I figured for this video, since I'm just trying to get a basic principle to you, I'm trying to hit this with a lot of different points quickly. So we're not diving into a complete look at this. We're just looking at a brief overview of the concept. Right? This is by no means a complete look at this concept. A complete look at this. It's not a complete transmission of the ideas, so to speak. So, for example, when discussing the knots, you know, there's the entire how do you actually make the knots and when do you use them. Well, I told you clove hitch here and then half hitch here, but I'm not going to take the time to show you how to make the knot. You can just Google that, right? Different tools, for example, ladders, right? So ladders, when you want to move ladders with rope, that has its own knot setup. It's not the same. You don't do it the same way as you do swords and spears and wood beams, right? In order to move it safely, efficiently, and silently, it's an entire different setup of knots, right? So we're not covering that. We're not going into that. You're not being shown the details of the knots, right? Like in detail. But we're doing that for the sake of keeping the video shorter, and also because it's just meant to be a brief overview. I'm trying to get the principle. I'm trying to introduce you to the principle. So again, the principle here, the real principle, is that tying the weapon or the tool correctly allows you to move it without causing extra movement and noise. Okay, so it allows for smooth and quiet hoisting of the weapon or the tool. That's the principle here. Now, having said all that, surprise, we're going to talk more about how to tie off the sword, but we're not going to go into great detail. This again is just a brief explanation. So if your sageo or your rope is tied off where the kurikata is, around where your kurikata on your saya is, then just run from there. You want to go through a hole in your tsuba, a hole through your guard, come up to the handle and do your half hitch on the handle, and then up to you. Now if you're, and we'll get into this about why it wouldn't be this way, but if you're not tied off around the kurikata, then you would want to put your clove hitch further down the saya. Run it up through a hole in the tsuba, and then half hitch around the handle and then up to you. If for some reason there's no hole in your tsuba, because some don't have holes, then obviously you can't use the hole. But if it does have a hole, then absolutely use it. It is really better to run it through a hole in the tsuba. And you do not need to fight over or worry about which hole. Just use it for hoisting, right? Where, whether does it have the urinuki hole, or does it just have one hole? As long as you can get your rope through it, whether you're using rope or whether you're using the sageo, just if you can get it through the hole, that's the only thing that matters. Don't overthink it. So let's talk about some alternatives to this, because of course most of you are probably assuming that when you're using a sword that you're going to be using a standard sageo, which in theory of course you can. However, you can also use, and in many ways it's superior to use, a separate piece of rope. Or if you're hardcore, you probably replace your normal sageo, your sort of government sanctioned length and material sageo, the generic sageo. You take that off and you replace it. So like you're on a real mission, you just replace that with a proper piece of rope, a proper bit of rope. All right. Yes, the sageo cord can be used for pulling the sword up. All right. But it cannot be used for some of the alternatives. For example, you cannot really climb with the Sagyo. If you climb off the sword and then pull the sword up, that's fine. But if you ever need to try to use the Sagyo cord itself to pull yourself up, you can't really use it. You have to replace it with real rope that can actually do the job. So like you can't use a grappling hook that's connected to the saya. So for example, there is a technique where you remove the standard sagyo and you replace it with a proper rope that has a grappling hook on the end. Or you just replace it with rope and you make like a lasso on the end and you can throw that up. Stuff like that. You can't do that with a normal sagyo. You have to replace it with a piece of with real rope to do that. So same thing, if for the ink stick, you in theory could untie and use your sword's standard sagyo, but it just makes so much more sense for the ink stick to have its own rope. So, and in theory, really, if you were running proper rope on your saya, then you could untie it from the saya and use it for the ink stick. Because in theory, you could have a sword and the ink stick at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other, right? And if you have the ink stick, it's probably better to use that for transversing than the sword. Anyway, the idea that I'm trying to convey is this, that in actual operations, the standard sagyo, the sagyo that most of you are thinking of when you think of sagyo, is less than ideal. So the concept here is replacing the sagyo with a proper bit of rope. That is ideal. Of course, when we're talking just about using the sword as a foothold, as a wedge, as a something to step up off of, then of course the standard sagyo can apply to that. So if you're just walking and you're like, I spontaneously want to sneak into this place. I've only got my sword with my standard sagyo. Of course you can use it as a foot wedge, wedge it in, use it to step off of and pull it up with a sagyo. Of course that is sufficient for that. If that's all you're doing, of course that's sufficient. But for more complicated applications, you really should consider replacing the standard sagyo with actual rope. And just briefly, just an FYI, in theory, when the rope is tied off on the ink stick correctly, the knotted areas can potentially serve as small footholds themselves. And in theory, though if tied off, those same tie-offs could be used as handles when the ink stick is using to ram or batter through something. Just saying. Just saying. Now remember though, now also just FYI, when we're talking about battering, in theory you can just straight up battering ram something, but it would also in theory, or not in theory, but in practice, it could be paired with like saws. So like I saw through some support beams first, then I use the battering ram to get in. Or like I have a comma-shaped saw and I'm using that to cut a hole, and then once I've sort of cut a shape, then I'll use the battering ram to get through the wall. Of course, it can be battering from zero, so to speak, but it doesn't have to be battering from zero. And in historical context is probably linked to another tool. So like before you batter, you pull out a saw, cut this, cut that, then use the battering ram. That is actually more accurate. Alright, that is all for this video. This was a different style video. Rather than going on and on and on and on in great depth, I've tried to hit a lot of different points quickly to give you a brief but comprehensive overview of the main ideas. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you liked this video, then please stay tuned, because as I work on the 13 generations of Nojiri document, I'm going to, in theory, drop videos like this now and then eventually a new and updated commentary to the Fukushima Ryu Shinobi no Maki, which is the Fukushima Ryu's Ninjutsu scroll, for those who are unfamiliar, that will be released eventually. And then that new and updated commentary will replace Sacred Conspiracy. right? And so this video is a sample of the kind of material that's going to be in the new and updated commentary. So like I said, if you liked it, please let me know. If you didn't like it, please let me know. If you liked it, tell me what was good. If you don't like it, tell me what was bad. All right, thank you.